Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Psychiatric Exile. This week, I'm going to be talking about Berserk, one of my favorite manga of all time. And as usual, I'm going to be exploring Berserk from a psychological perspective, specifically the psychology of gods and how he moves through the different stages, different mythological stages of the hero. So, as we know, this is a creation of Kentaro Miura, who passed sadly relatively young in 2021. He wrote 41 volumes, and the publication is being continued under the supervision of his friend Koji Mori. There's been multiple anime adaptations, all of them problematic in terms of production and animation quality, but I'm partial to the 1997 adaptation. Is my favorite one. Is how I came into the Berserk universe, and I think that's true for a lot of us in outside of Japan. And the book and theory I'm going to be using for this video is The Origins and History of Consciousness by Eric Newman, a student of Carl Jung. He died in 1960 and published this book in 1949. And there's a quote from this book that struck me, left a significant impression on me because, and I think this happened to a lot of us that became fans of Berserk. Um, After seeing the anime, we were perplexed. The story and the events of the anime exerted some sort of fascination that made us orbit back around this manga to think about it, to continue the story on the manga and not be satisfied with just seeing the anime. And I always wondered why that was the case. It happens not only with Berserk, but when a work of art connects with you deeply, it exerts some sort of fascination that makes you keep thinking about it, examine it from different angles and whatnot. And Newman talks about that fascination. If we think of the Berserk story as a symbol, then you can substitute Berserk for symbol here, and it would read: Berserk formulates an essential unconscious component. This is what makes it so attractive and disturbing. Consciousness, consciousness keeps on returning to it and circles around it fascinated. So every time that we encounter a symbol, something that formulates an essential unconscious component, we are facing a part of ourselves, something that we may not be completely aware of. And we come back to it because we want to understand, or the work of art constellates the unconscious, the contents of the unconscious in such a way that it brings harmony or some sort of peace where before there was not. So the theoretical foundation for this video is that, number one, again, and this is based on the book by Newman and Jungian theory in general. Ontology repeats phylogeny. So what that means is that the development of the individual repeats the stages of the development of the species. And Newman postulates that in terms of its psychological aspect, from a psychological standpoint, mankind went through a series of stages, and each of us, so that's the phylogeny, the history of the species, and then each of us in our own personal development go through the same stages, psychological stages, as mankind went through. For example, he says that at one point, the normal was for the person to define himself or herself as part of the group with no, not much of an individual existence. So your role, what you thought, how you were supposed to live, all that was defined by the group. And then eventually, mankind saw the emergence of a genius of some kind, individuals that were increasingly independent from the group. And as such, they were the ones that in turn led the group, either out of the land where they lived or incorporated some new invention or new ideas that redefined the group. Back then, Newman says that was very, very rare. Nowadays is the norm. Each of us is an individual. Humanity moved to the point where everybody is now an individual. But what is now the norm back then was the exception. Likewise, when we're born, we're not born as an individual. We share a continuous experience with our mom, first in the womb, and later until it is not until we develop a sense of self, a verbal capacity that defines the me, the I, that we separate from the rest of the world as an individual. So we repeat, in that sense, the history of mankind. Now, when these individuals that thought and acted independently of the group first appeared, that was a monumental event. And that was recorded in the form of myths. So what we see, says Newman, what we see when we study myth is a series of layers where each layer, it's a historical record of a stage of psychological development for mankind. That's number one. Number two, and this is a basic tenet of Jungian theory, there is a shared universal layer of the unconscious mind, the collective unconscious. It's inherited and intrinsic to the species. What they're saying here is that we're not born a blank slate. We bring something to the table. As a human being, we are born with certain anatomical structures in the brain, and that those inherited structures are predetermined and inherited, and we're born with them. So not everything is acquired through experience or social conditioning. Consciousness arises and develops out of the unconscious, and during its development, it needs to fight a tendency to return to its origin. So again, first, it's the unconscious, the existence in the womb or the existence in the group. And then out of that unconscious, we develop a consciousness, an ego, an I. And we have a tendency to move forward and continue to develop that individuality, but we also have a tendency to go back. We'll see in a minute why, and go back to the unconscious. And that tension is always there with us. Number four, the myths we find around the world share a common structure because they reflect the universal process of an ego coming into its own. That's recapitulating what I was saying before. And finally, it is my own theory that Berserk has the structure of a myth. Therefore, it serves as symbol, and that's why it's so fascinating for a lot of us. So, psychologically speaking, we start with the unconscious. In myth, the unconscious is symbolized in the form of a dragon or Ouroboros. We'll talk about this in a second. And in Berserk, it is represented by Griffith, who's also, psychologically speaking, a sort of mother figure for gods. Out of the unconscious emerges consciousness. In myth, that's represented by the hero. In Berserk, that would be gods. And in terms of family dynamics, that's the role of the son. So if you think about what we see in everyday life, sometimes there's an excessively possessive mother who doesn't want the child to become independent. She wants the child to continue to live for her, to serve her needs, her psychological needs, and keeps the son or the daughter in a sort of psychological cage, like a bird. In Berserk, we see the equivalent dynamic when, after the first duel, Griffith tells gods, "Now you are mine, you belong to me." Psychologically, you're not going to be independent. Your life is going to be given meaning by my dreams. You're going to be a tool of my goals, and you're not going to develop as your own person. Eventually, it is the role, the fight, the goal of the child to fight for his independence so that he can live his own life and become his own person. And in Berserk, that happened when God challenged Griffith to the duel and defeated him, and then for the first time was able to walk with his own sense of purpose and goal to become his own person. But we know eventually this led to the eclipse because Griffith, as a possessive mother, he couldn't let go. And he came back in the form of a monster to devour the child that was trying to become independent. So Newman says that in the history of myth, we see stages where the mother is represented differently in each stage of the history of myth, depending on the stage of psychological development that corresponded to that particular layer of myth. So, the very first myths that we encounter, according to Newman, show the mother as a soul creator. And he calls the mother as a soul creator the Ouroboros. Ouroboros is this figure of a serpent eating its own tail. I contend that God belongs here as the type of hero who whose mother is the soul creator. After that, later in history, we see a second layer of myths that show the mother as being impregnated by a transpersonal god or demon. And later than that, finally, we see a third stage where the mother is impregnated by the king god. I think that in Berserk we're moving in this layer right here with Mother as Soul Creator. So why does Newman calls the Mother as Soul Creator the Ouroboros? Well, he says that the Ouroboros, this figure of the serpent eating its own tail, is a perfect representation of the unconscious. In the unconscious, the state of, first of all, before we become aware, before we develop a sense of I, before we develop our verbal abilities, we live in the unconscious world. We live in a state of being contained in the whole, without responsibility or effort, without any doubts, and no division of the world into opposites. Kind of everything is a continuity because if you don't define yourself as an individual, this is where I start and this is where I end, then there's no division between you and the world. So there's only a continuity. And with that, there is no conflict. Newman says that we experience this as paradise. and we're always nostalgic, wanting to return to it. Remember when we talked about a tendency to want to return to the unconscious? This is why. Because when we become aware, when we develop a sense of I, we're born into a world of opposites, of conflict, of pain and struggle, whereas before we were in paradise. So we have to choose: do we move forward and become, continue to develop as an adult, or do we go back to this world of pre consciousness? Then, in the unconscious, all the opposites exist simultaneously without any conflict. Again, because things are not divided into opposites. Unconscious is equal to totality. And things that usually symbolize the unconscious meet one of two criteria, or it meets both criteria. First criteria: the symbols of totality or the unconscious take the form of a circle and its variants or variants. For example, the sphere, the egg, the mandala. Remember Angel's Egg, recently back in theaters? This is a mandala. All these things represent the unconscious because they're variants of the circle. Why the circle? Because it has no beginning and no end. See? No beginning and no end is a continuity, like a preconscious existence. The second condition is a union of opposites. Remember that in the unconscious, all opposites exist. So anything that symbolizes the union of opposites is also a symbol of the unconscious. For example, squaring the circle, or the hermaphrodite of alchemy, female and male. In the case of Berserk, we see it in the form of the eclipse, the moon and the sun coming together in a apocalyptic, cataclysmic event. So Newman says, I'm going to call the mother a soul creator the Ouroboros, because the Ouroboros is a perfect representation of the unconscious. Why? Why is this a perfect symbol? First, it's a circle, no beginning, no end, a continuous experience, like an unconscious existence. Secondly, is the union of two opposites: devour, devouring and being devoured, eating and being eaten. So the Ouroboros as symbol meets both criteria. It's a circle and it's a union of opposites. It's self-contained, without beginning or end. It's eternal and therefore represents existence before the emergence of consciousness. Okay, so eventually each of us developed a sense of I, a sense of individuality. We developed our own consciousness. Like I said earlier, with consciousness comes duality, separateness, and suffering. So there's going to be a tendency towards wanting to remain unconscious or going back to being unconscious. This is going to be counteracted by a desire to become more conscious, more independent, to become an adult. Newman calls this tendency towards the unconscious, towards wanting to go back to the unconscious or remain unconscious, the Euroboric incest, so wanting to lay with the Euroboric figure of the mother, a desire to be dissolved and absorbed passively into the unconscious, because consciousness is experienced as painful. Think of Shinji in Neon Genesis Evangelion and the Instrumentality Project, and you'll get another picture of this. Now, in Berserk, when did gods came to this point, arrived to this point? Remember when Griffith was talking with Charlotte, and he was saying that he didn't consider anyone in the Band of the Hawks his friend, because for him to call a man his friend or someone his friend, he needed to see him as an equal. Well, gods realized then and there that that's how Griffith saw him. That illusion that they were one, that they were on equal footing, that they were equals, that they were the same, was shattered, and a division was created between Griffith and Guts. So this is the moment where Guts, psychologically speaking, became an individual. It was a moment of pain. It was a moment that shattered that golden age of the Band of the Hawks. And now Guts had to contend with this and decide what he wanted to do with this. And what he wanted to do with it was to continue to be with Griffith up to a point, but once he achieved his goal, Griffith that he helped Griffith achieve his goal, he was going to go his own way and become his own man. Okay, so we saw in an earlier slide that in the history of myth, the mother shows three different stages. Accordingly, the son, the hero, also shows respectively three different stages. The son as son, the first stage, the most primitive, is the son lover. The second one is the struggler, and the third one is finally is the hero. The son lover is the one that achieves detachment from the Ouroboros. Again, this is symbolizing the emergence of consciousness from the unconscious, detachment from the maternal figure in a psychological sense. But at this stage, this detachment is not definitive. It's things are still very fluid, and the sun lover kind of waxes and wanes. Sometimes he is independent and detached from the Ouroboros. Sometimes he goes back. He gives in to that tendency to want to go back to paradise with no conflict and no pain and no suffering. The struggler, which is the next stage, the struggler, on the other hand, is definitely detached and separated from the Ouroboros. He enters the world and encounters the principle of opposites. It's that point where God says, "Okay, I guess I'm on my own, and I'm gonna have to walk, my own path." And the hero is the final stage, is the figure in myth who actively champions the position of consciousness against the dragon of the unconscious. This is the figure that we see, killing the dragon, rescuing the damsel, and attaining the treasure of great value in the mythic structure. So, in my opinion, we see gods going through all three stages in Berserk. This is the stroke, one of the ways, in which Miura shows a stroke of genius. The song lover usually is an adolescent figure or adolescent, psychologically speaking, who experiences Ouroboros as the mother goddess. The great mother, the earth mother, the mother goddess can only be made fruitful by death, dismemberment, castration, and sacrifice. Eventually, the hero is going to do that to the dragon, so he's going to return the favor to the mother figure. Uh, but at this stage in myth, in these early myths, we see the great mother can only be made fruitful by death, dismemberment, castration, and sacrifice. And Newman goes on to quote any number of myths from back in history that share this structure where the sun lover is killed, dismembered, and orchestrated. Now, the Band of the Hawks relates to Griffith as the song lover relates to the great mother, and that includes gods earlier, early in the story too. Why do I say that? Because for all these guys and Casca, they had achieved some sort of individuality, but like the song lover, that detachment was fluid. It waxed and waned. They were individuals to a point, but when it came to giving their life meaning, their meaning was given by Griffith. Their goals were given by Griffith. Their dreams were Griffith's dream. So Psychologically speaking, they were at the stage of the song lover, where the mother is everything. They were individuals only to the point, but everything is defined and deferred, defined by the mother figure and deferred to the mother. I didn't see it coming at the time, but Newman would have said this is not going to end well because the myths that show this structure always end up in death, dismemberment, castration, and sacrifice. And boy, do we see that in the eclipse. We see all of it: death, dismembered, sacrifice, castration, all of it. So that's the culmination of this dynamic. Griffith sacrificed his son, his child, the man of the hawks, to achieve his dream, to be made fruitful so that he could achieve his dream and rule the world. He sacrificed the band of the hawks as predicted in the history of myth by the song lover and great mother dynamics. Now, God survived, and he survived. He lost an arm, he lost his right eye, and when he survived, he moved on to the stage of the struggler, the second stage. First one, son lover, second one, struggler. This is a quote from Newman's book. It says, failure is not expressed by castration and dismemberment, like in the case of the great mother and the band of the hawks, but by defeat and captivity, and occasionally by blinding. So God's losing an eye, which is reminiscent of Wotan receiving the gift of prophecy from Erda, but in return having to sacrifice his right eye. So this is the price that God has to pay for moving from the son lover stage to the struggler stage. Castration in the form of losing an eye and losing an arm. Says Newman, the head and the eye as symbols of the masculine and spiritual side of consciousness imply that blinding is a form of castration. The vanquished may be rescued by a hero, and defeat may end up in victory. And we see how Guts is rescued by the Skull Knight during the eclipse. Once Guts moved to the stage of the struggler, his whole dynamic is going to be to overcome fate, which is Griffith's, in this case, Griffith's ascendancy over his ego, and asserting his will, his own ego in the world. And if you remember, the original adaptation, anime adaptation, started on every episode with something like, in this world, is there something like the hand of God that guides man's destiny, or is it his own will? It's this battle, because this is where God is now, and for most of the story, this is where he is. Moving from fate, being subordinate to Griffiths and his will and his wishes, and asserting his own will in the world. This is his stage here. Now the struggler, the problem with the struggler is his whole thing is to oppose the mother. In the case of gods, is the whole thing is vengeance and killing Griffith and hating Griffith, and that's very limiting. It's hard to live a complete, satisfying life in harmony if you're living such a hateful existence. So, what started with the second duel, when gods became independence of Griffith, culminated in the eclipse. Now there was no turning back. He was not only independent of Griffith, but hated his existence. He wanted to kill him, to make him suffer, to frustrate his dream, to live for hating Griffith, to live for vengeance. And in myth, we see that when this happens, existence of the character now becomes flight and resistance. And this is God's life for most of the story. He's fighting the apostles and trying to kill Griffith, and he cannot even sleep in peace. Every time that he tries to fall asleep, these spectral creatures come to torture him and kill him and make him suffer. So his whole existence now is flight and resistance, flight and fight. And says Newman, the attitude of defiance and refusal to love leads to the very thing the terrible mother wants. So, isn't this what Griffith would have wanted? Wouldn't Griffith love all this? That God still lives for him? That he's still the most powerful figure in God's life? That God is not really living for life, he's living for hate and vengeance. He has no one to love and no life of his own other than as defined by Griffith. This is what Griffith always wanted. In a sense, God is still his. He still belongs to him. So the goal would be to break free from the great mother fixation and from the revenge of Griffith fixation, to move on, to live, to be able to live for once independently of Griffith. Otherwise, the passive fate of being castrated and driven mad, which we saw in the stage of the Song Lover, is just superseded by active self castration and suicide. Self castration in the form of not having anyone to love in your life, that's psychological castration, and suicide because he's God's is, you know, fighting with abandon all these super powerful creatures, not thinking about his well-being, and this is just gonna get him killed. So it's a form of suicide. Hopefully, we'll see at some point that God stops living for vengeance and starts living for life. Newman says a man possessed by a particular content has an enormous dynamism in him, but this counteracts ego development. In the real world, we see it in the form of very successful people, sometimes very successful artists or businessmen or politicians that live a completely unbalanced life with no love in their lives, no affection, no space for anyone else in their everyday life, but their own ego, just their own ego. And yes, this hate and this wish for revenge helps God push himself to the limit and achieve things that a normal person wouldn't be able to achieve. But at what price? He's forgetting his life, being unable to live a fruitful life, psychologically speaking. This is represented, I think, by the Berserker armor. Again, going back to Newman's book, he says possession by an unconscious content entails loss of consciousness and has an intoxicating effect. One smitten by it is always under the sway of the Great Mother and is threatened with the fate of all her youthful lover, effeminacy and castration, basically being transformed into the mother, versus madness and death. So when God uses the Berserker armor, it has an intoxicating effect, and it potentiates all his strength and his abilities. But by doing this, he's still smitten and he's still under the sway of the Great Mother, and is putting himself at risk of madness and death. And we know that the more he uses the Berserker armor, the more at risk he is of not being able to come back to being a normal person, just losing himself into the armor. This is from the manga, I found it very interesting that the Skull Knight calls gods struggler. It really sent me in the direction of this interpretation. Now, hopefully, what we'll see is that gods. So we saw gods as the sun lover when he was in the Band of the Hawks. Then we've seen him as struggler for most of the story. Hopefully, we are seeing him move to the next stage and become a true hero. And I think Miura left some indications in the story that pointed towards the fact that God is destined to be a hero. There's a whole work by Otto Rank. He's a Freudian psychoanalyst. It's called The Myth of the Birth of the Hero, that goes into the structure that the birth of the hero follows in pretty much all myths, or most of them, anyways. For example, the hero has two families. One is a very special, very powerful, maybe even supernatural family. And the other one, the second one, is a very common earthly family that adopts the hero as a child and raises him as their own. And usually the hero kills this second father, the earthly father, the adoptive father, which in God's case was Gambrino. And this earthly father oftentimes is the one that sends the hero into danger. And we know that Gambrino is the one that initiated God into the life of a mercenary. So he meets this criteria. He's also God is born from a corpse, and therefore we see again a union of opposites. Um, the newborn coming out of a corpse, life coming out of death. The Skull Knight even tells him, "You were born from a corpse and began your life, yeah, in the mud, so you're closer to the death than anyone. Thus, you excel in escaping it." Another cue, I think, that Miura left, that Guts is destined to be a hero, not just a struggler. Now, Guts never had a maternal figure. This is an aside, and I think that's why he so easily fell into the trap of projecting the maternal figure onto Griffith, and and then fall under the spell of those dynamics. So, what is the hero supposed to do if God takes this next step and stops being the struggler and becomes the hero? Newman says the hero is not only the conqueror of the dragon, the mother figure, or in this case, Griffith, he also kills the terrible female aspect so as to liberate the fruitful and bountiful aspect. And we know that he got Katska from the band of the Hawks, and we also know that she just regained her sanity. This rescuing of the damsel from the maternal figure is another deed of the hero. In myth, we often see that the hero kills a monster, let's say a dragon, and he rescues the damsel in distress from the dragon. Psychologically, according to Newman, what this means is that this whole dragon and damsel figures are just two aspects of one. The mother is, or the feminine. The dragon is the negative aspect. The damsel is the fruitful and bountiful positive aspect. So the hero is supposed to separate the two, rescue the damsel, and then live a fruitful life from then forward. Psychologically, that means the development of consciousness by overcoming the tendency to go back to the unconscious, to that elusive paradise of our original experience in the world. Now, I didn't like these characters very much at first, but now I understand, on this under this slide, now I understand their role. Their role is to make sure that God keeps his humanity. This new group of friends and Shirky, the little witch, that he keeps his humanity to keep him anchored to the everyday world of emotions of the human heart, so that he can overcome the struggler stage and live not for death, not for vengeance, but for life and love, become his own man and live his own life independently of Griffith. Now, does that mean that he's going to turn his back on Griffith and live happily ever after? Probably not. Femto Griffith is going to fall. And I always wonder, how is that going to happen? Because the gap in power is so huge. I mean, gods cannot even get close to Griffith. So how is he going to defeat him? And well, thinking about this, using Newman's theory, of myth and applying it to Berserk, it occurred to me that Femto Griffith is going to fall from within. You remember when gods did everything right. He stepped up to Griffith, he defeated him, he went and, went on his own way. He came back, he took control of the band of the Hawks, he rescued Griffith, he fell in love with Casca, and she became pregnant. And he did everything right. And those decisions were fruitful. Casca became pregnant with this child. It's just that Griffith, being the terrible mother, he couldn't let go. He came back as a monster and devoured the band of the Hawks, and now made sure that God became a struggler. Yes, he let where he's still living, defining his life based on Griffith. Now, during the eclipse, Griffith raped Casca and corrupted the child in the womb. And that child in the womb became who was supposed to be this, became this. When Griffith was incarnated back into the world, from Femto back to Griffith so he could rule the world, this corrupted child was incorporated in that incarnation. And I think that that's going to be the root, the cause of Griffith's downfall. It's going to happen from within, as caused by the product of God's and Casca's love. And this would be symbolic of God's final emancipation from Griffith as mother figure. So then everything would make sense, where this fruitful love destroys the terrible mother from within, and Gods and Casca are now free to live their life in harmony and love, and not just death and destruction and hate and vengeance. Just a theory, but let me know what you guys think and about this and the video in general. Any thoughts would be appreciated. As usual, thank you so much for your time, and I'll see you guys take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again next time. But this attitude of defiance and refusal to love, but this attitude of defiance and refusal to love